Hi, I'm Heather McLean from the Alliance Against the Northern Past, and today I'm going to be interviewing Jack Savage from the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. And we are in Concord at their beautiful building right now, and we're going to talk about the blocking action that they've been taking against the Northern Pass project and how that effort's been going and sort of the results of what's been happening with that. How are you doing today, Jack?
I'm great. Thanks very much for having me.
Always. We're always ready to interview you. You always have us with the latest updates. And one of the reasons why I like interviewing Jack is because I believe that the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests is one of the most powerful tools that we've had to stop this project from happening in its current form, in its current proposed form. And the fact that they've been using some parcels of land that they've been putting under conservation easements, and that has been one of the most powerful things that has been happening to date, besides what's been happening in the legislature with the Senate Bill 361 Commission. Then they've been doing a wonderful job of deciding that it is feasible to put these lines underground through our state. And so let's start by talking about what the Forest Society's been doing.
Right. So as I think most people know, Northern Pass is a proposal to put more than 1,100 towers across 180 miles of New Hampshire, starting in Pittsburgh, coming down through Groveton and Franconia Notch, Franklin, Concord, and all the way to Deerfield. And the Forest Society's concern, first and foremost, is that we have a legal and ethical obligation to protect existing conserved lands, not the least of which is the White Mountain National Forest. And this project would impact 10 miles of the White Mountain National Forest. We were founded in order to create the White Mountain National Forest, so we think that's particularly important. There are another 33 conserved parcels this would impact, including our own conserved lands: Washburn Family Forest, the Kaufman Forest, the Rocks in Bethlehem, and some other easements that we hold. And so our goal is to stop them from putting these up to 140-foot towers across 180 miles of the landscape. In order to do that, we think we have to stop them up north, in particularly in Clarksville and Stewartstown. And we've been working with as part of our Trees Not Towers campaign to slowly box them in, block them as they attempt to find a route through that part of the state. By doing that, we believe that we can protect the rest of the state from this proposal. From the Forest Society's standpoint, there may be a way, if ultimately it's desirable to have some of this power go to southern New England, where the demand may someday be. There are viable ways to do it. So we're not objecting necessarily to the concept. We are objecting to the method they're proposing to do it, which ultimately is the cheap and easy way to do it.
Right, which everybody seems to be interested in right now because of the state of our economy.
Well, I would point out that the other viable ways of doing it, such as burial along state transportation corridors, would most likely create more jobs than doing it this way. It comes down to this. Hydro Quebec wants to export power in order to subsidize the Canadian ratepayers. If they're going to do that and provide power to southern New England, they need to be paid made to pay to do this in a responsible manner. So our goal is to compel that to occur by undergrounding or using an existing HVDC line that already goes through Vermont and New Hampshire. Anyway, so we are making good progress. We outlined a plan 6 months ago, 5 months ago, in which we needed to raise $2.5 million to put conservation easements on at least 4 properties. We closed on one of those properties, Green Acre Woodlands, a 530-acre conservation easement right up here in Stewartstown. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of land. One of the reasons that it's valuable from a conservation standpoint is that it's fairly high ground that's open. And so from a wildlife habitat standpoint, it's pretty important bird habitat. As part of the conservation easement, it will remain open to the public, for things like hiking, snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, if there's a trail there, and hunting and fishing. So it's an important conservation project regardless, but it becomes and became all the more important and a priority for us because it will help block Northern Pass. We have more money to raise and more money to go. At this point, as at the end of the year, we've raised about half of what we need towards our 2.5 million goal. So we're at $1.25 million.
That's pretty impressive.
It is, just given that we just started essentially at the beginning of September in raising that money. So we'll continue that process, and we'll continue to close others of these easements as the winter progresses. We've also been talking to other landowners. We acknowledged in late December that we had recorded some options and some donated easements along other lands. Okay. In one place along Route 145, along the Clarksville-Stewartstown border that blocks Northern Pass's intended route. And we recently recorded some additional easements in Stewartstown, or options I should say, that block an attempted workaround that Northern Pass has been working on. So, as I said, we're step-by-step boxing them in, making it impossible for them to get from the Canadian border down to Groveton, where they'd like to be able to pick up the PSNH distribution right away. It's important to notice that they have many regulatory hurdles to go across still at this point. First of all, they've put the presidential permit on hold at this point. I think they recognize that they have to have a complete route in order to restart that process, and they don't have it. And I think thanks to the actions we're taking, they won't get it. If we're successful in raising this money and closing these easements, they won't get a complete route. Second of all, very important, and they sort of dismiss this, but it's critical to their entire plan. They need a special use permit in order to be able to make use of the right-of-way that goes through the White Mountain National Forest. That is a larger hurdle than you might think.
Right, and they very much downplay that.
Well, you might think about it. This is a private commercial development project. Correct. We wouldn't likely allow Walmart to build a store in the middle of the White Mountain National Forest. So I'm not quite sure why we would ever allow a private commercial transmission line development in the middle of White Mountain National Forest. There's no demonstrable public usefulness to this. This is essentially a competitive project. It's allowed Northeast Utilities and Hydro Quebec to compete with National Grid and others in the open market. So that's not the purpose of the White Mountain National Forest, and so it's a very high bar for them in order for them to get that special use permit. And then third, and perhaps most important, the Site Evaluation Committee, the SEC, which is the state process, and they are a long way from even putting in an application of that. It all stems from being able to not only identify a route, but to do more than wish for it and actually have the rights to make use of the land they wish to cross. And we're determined to make sure they never get to that point.
And it's pretty amazing because strategically speaking, where you've got these pieces of land, they literally have land on both sides of lands that you are putting under easement.
That's right, yeah.
So they cannot string the towers.
There's gaps, that's correct, yeah. So they have gaps between their intended route, and we're working and successfully working to make sure they cannot breach those gaps.
Now, one of the things that is helping you is some of this conserved land where the headwaters are. Okay, so they would literally have to like cross into those territories to get around some of the
right. And the important part there is that a year ago, the fight in the legislature over the eminent domain issue clarified that. The legislation, the HB 648 bill that passed last January and signed into law by the governor in March, I believe, clarified New Hampshire's law and New Hampshire's Constitution to make it clear that a private project like this, a so-called merchant project or participant-funded project, does not have the right to petition the PUC for the use of eminent domain. So they can't take the land by force, and without that, they can't condemn an existing conservation easement, nor can they force a landowner to sell. And there are many landowners who don't want to sell, and we're providing them with an alternative, an opportunity to conserve their land instead. The other thing that I think is important about our project is that they've bought a lot of land up there.
Yes.
They've spent a lot of money to buy a lot of land up there.
That would be my other question.
And in anticipation of Northern Pass as a specific proposal going away, I think what we next need to be concerned about is what happens in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Exactly. So these conservation easements are permanent, and so our goal is to permanently protect New Hampshire's landscape from overhead transmission lines such as these. So that's why we're working on these permanent conservation easements.
Now, in doing so, one of the things that I think we all see is that Hydro Quebec would like to start stringing multiple lines. So if they were to receive that 40 miles from through Coos and Stewartstown, whatever, they would be able to maybe even begin a series of lines that went down through there.
That's certainly a concern, I think a legitimate concern, that we are on the precipice, and what we're trying to stop happening is the industrialization of a very rural landscape. Once they began buying lands outright, they can grant themselves the right to put potentially more than one line. And we know that Hydro Quebec is interested in exporting not just 1,200 megawatts that represented by Northern Pass, but up to 5,000 megawatts over time, if they can find the market for it. And so we need to make sure that New Hampshire doesn't become the industrialized transmission corridor for southern New England.
That's correct. And it's very important that we work with the Senate and the legislature for New Hampshire so that these burial laws can maybe come to fruition.
Well, that's what's very encouraging about this. As I know you know, Heather, the SB 361 Commission took a look and asked a very reasonable question. So is it viable to bury these lines, in particular along already disturbed areas such as state transportation corridors? And their finding was that it was viable, and that there are other transmission developers who are proposing to do exactly that, including one in Vermont and New York and another over in Maine. And so that raises the question, well, why not in New Hampshire? And what's encouraging about that is that there could be a win-win here, is that we could prepare the state to make it easier for transmission developers to do this the right way, if they feel the need to do so. And that's a very positive development. In fact, I think what we should look forward to happening perhaps is Hydro Quebec coming to the understanding that Northern Pass is a dud. It didn't work as proposed. Northeast Utilities was unable to secure a route. And that if they want to begin transmitting electricity sometime in the next 20 years, they're going to have to work with a different partner to do it a different way. And it wouldn't surprise me to see other transmission developers opening up a dialogue with Hydro Quebec in order to make use of the state's willingness to look more closely and make it easier for a proposal to underground transmission lines in New Hampshire.
Yes, and it's important also to note, for those who don't maybe know, that when you try to bury a line through some of these more rural and uncut areas, it's more difficult, more expensive, rather than going into the state-owned right-of-ways where the ground is already softened.
Well, I think that's true. From the expense standpoint, I think we have to acknowledge that burying transmission lines is more expensive than overgrounding them. But when I hear someone say that it's too expensive to do, what I hear them saying is that New Hampshire's landscape is not worth the cost, and I firmly reject that notion. New Hampshire's landscape absolutely is worth that, and there's been a ton invested over time in conserving much of that landscape, and we shouldn't let that go. It's part of our economy in and of itself, whether it's tourism or what have you, and so it's absolutely worth the cost, and we should be making the Canadians pay for it. Look, it comes down to this. Hydro Quebec wants to subsidize their own ratepayers by exporting energy to southern New England. If they want to do that, and if they and if southern New England is interested in paying for this power, we need to make Hydro Quebec pay the price for doing so responsibly.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that this action that you guys are doing is one of the most profound things that we can do, because you're starting here and then it's going to change everything from down below. Now the question is, they have bought all this land up here and you're blocking them, so if this becomes a dud and it goes nowhere, what happens to that land that PSNH has spent millions on? Millions.
Hard to know. Much of it abuts existing conservation land. Perhaps someday it will become conserved as well.
There you go. That would be great. Okay, so and if you would like to help the Forest Society reach their goal of 2.4, 2.5 million, to conserve these lands, then you can give them the information that
Sure. The easiest way to go do it is to go right to our website, www.forestsociety.org. There's a big banner right on the home page, and you can click on our blog and get the latest update, or you can go right to the special projects page, or you can make a donation online. You can also just call us, 224-9945, 603-224-9945. Happy to talk to you and tell you the latest updates, and we can take a donation via credit card right over the phone, or we can tell you how to send it to the Forest Society and help you do what's right for you.
And again, to be clear, that this conservation land is not just to be, it's got multiple uses, so it's not just blocking the northern pass, it's also opening up lands for people to actually go and play.
Well, in the case of the Green Acres, Green Acre Woodlands parcel, that 530 acres, that's absolutely. These are easements. We're not buying it in fee.
Right.
We're allowing the private landowner to continue to manage the land. And we just ensure that first and foremost there aren't towers and power lines on it, but secondly that it remains in a rural state.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to share with the Alliance?
Well, I would just thank everybody who's already supported this, everybody who supports it in any way that they can. You know, the Forest Society got involved in this in part because we saw the reaction that, the visceral reaction people were having to this proposal. And we understood that we needed to support what the state clearly wanted. And so we really appreciate everything that everyone else has done. This has been, as I like to say, we didn't start the party, we joined the party. And it's been a remarkable journey so far. And I think we're in a better position today to stop Northern Pass than at any point in the last 2 years.
I have a question, Jack.
You have a question, George?
I have a Jack. Yeah, this is George from behind the camera. What do you have to say about their not meeting their year-end goal by announcing a route? Do you think?
Well, I think that they were attempting to say something positive without having any news to announce. You know, they tried their best in order to complete a route, and they couldn't. They couldn't in large part because landowners up there aren't interested in selling to them, and because we were working with specific landowners strategically to block their intended route.
Willing landowners.
Right, willing landowners, absolutely. Yeah.
I love that statement.
And so they were trying to find a positive spin on something that wasn't particularly good news for them. And like I said, I think what we can look forward to seeing perhaps is other transmission developers beginning conversations with Hydro Quebec to maybe do this in a better way that would find more acceptance in the state.
Mhm.
So Northern Pass made a non-statement, essentially. They were trying to sort of, I think, backpedal, or they were trying to say something positive in a situation that was pretty dire for them.
Well, what they have like to say that they 2 years ago they drew a line on a map and said this is our preferred route. Since then they have talked about wanting to do a different route. It's not really all that different. It's still 180 miles, or probably a little bit more, over ground
Right.
from Pittsburgh to Deerfield. So it's really not any different at all. The one difference is, and if somebody wants to see the route that they didn't want to announce, their intended route where they're trying to go, they can go to our website and see a map of that. And it's up here, it cuts across and goes down this side of the Nass Stream State Forest and cuts back through over to Groveton. They didn't want to provide any details, but we know where they intend to go. You can see that on a map on our website if you'd like to.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And George, any more questions?
Another question. At one time, I was over in Vermont last summer camping, and some people in Vermont were kind of upset that they were talking about the Northern Pass was coming down on the Vermont side and going to cut back into New Hampshire around Groveton. Have you heard anything about that?
I'm sorry, say that again, George.
When I was camping in Vermont last July, some people that I was talking to over there were a little upset that Northern Pass was going to come down through Vermont and cut into Groveton. Do you know anything about that? Or do you...
Well, we have pointed out that this line that starts in the exact same place that Northern Pass would come from in Canada, there's an existing line that comes down through Vermont, comes into New Hampshire in the Littleton area, and then proceeds down through the state on its way to Ayer, Mass. Mm-hmm. And we pointed out that both Vermont and New Hampshire are already hosting a through route for HVDC transmission lines. And that if you wanted to add a line to that, that might be a better place to start a conversation rather than trying to create a new route through New Hampshire. And so I think there might be some people in Vermont who recognize that that might be one option that ultimately is looked at.
Now, is that National Grid?
That's the National Grid controlled corridor, correct.
Yeah, and that would route around the White Mountain National Forest.
It comes very close, and it has its own impacts, but it's already a line that hosts the same kind of transmission line and tower that Northern Pass proposes. So there's a certain amount of logic to considering that as co-locating a new line, should it be viable to export more of that energy in the first place.
Okay. Future is coming, and we'll have to have another interview to see if there are any updates in the future, near future. And hopefully you're going to make all of the money for your goal. So start by personal donation today.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate everybody's help, and we fully expect to reach the goal.
So I wanted to ask you one more question.
Sure.
And that is the viewpoint from some people who I feel are really not educated on the subject about clean, renewable power. And there are some people who really believe that hydropower, big hydropower from Quebec, even though it could flood miles and miles of land in sensitive areas that are carbon reducing, carbon absorbing forests, they believe that flooding these carbon reducing forests and absorbing forests is clean, renewable energy, and that the Forest Society and anybody like myself who's against things like the Northern Pass are considered obstructionists and left-wing wackos that, you know, okay, it really almost does not dignify an answer. However, I do believe that people do need to understand this concept of big hydro and whether it's clean and renewable.
Sure. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about that. There are those who are very concerned about the kind of large-scale hydro flooding millions of acres, literally in areas larger than the size of New Hampshire.
Yes.
5 times the size of Lake Winnipesaukee in order to generate this power, and what kind of impact that has, not only on the environment, but people in the way, and so forth. And that's a legitimate question. The Forest Society hasn't taken a position on that. Our focus is on the state of New Hampshire. However, when it comes to renewable energy and renewable power, the key is what it displaces. Does it reduce the use of fossil fuels to generate other power? A New England power generator study looked at this situation and concluded that in the near term at least, in order for Hydro Quebec to export 1,200 megawatts of hydropower to southern New England, they would need to divert that power, that hydropower, from energy they're currently sending to Ontario.
Okay.
And how the way Ontario would necessarily respond is to fire up their capacity to generate electricity using natural gas, which is the cheapest form these days anyway. And so what we would end up is feeling good ourselves perhaps because we were using so-called renewable energy, but not having any net reduction in fossil fuels. That gets us nowhere from an environmental standpoint. And that points out one of the failures of this Northern Pass proposal, that it's not really about reducing carbon. It has no guarantees of reducing carbon. It has no guarantees of reducing even PSNH's own coal plant in Bow. As a matter of fact, when they were asked about that, would you consider, you know, shutting down the Bow plant earlier, they said, oh no, it's the cleanest coal plant in New England. And so that's really a marketing ploy in order to sort of appeal to people's sense that renewable power is better. But at the end of the day, it doesn't do the job, which is guarantee any reductions in fossil fuels.
Okay, and that's important. And I can actually bring up the fact that it will pollute the waters with mercury because of the rotting vegetation, that it will actually release more carbon and more methane into the air, that it can be dirtier than some of these fossil fuels. I'll bring that up. You guys can stay neutral. But okay, thank you for answering that question for me.
Sure, my pleasure.